Today's topic of the presentation is nothing less a trillion-dollar question. So I will go a little bit more detail on how we see kind of these market prospects for our space economy. So before I go there, I just want to touch briefly about Euroconsult for the people maybe less familiar with the company. So we're a global consulting firm, but really specialized, dedicated on the satellite sector. We touch basically everything in the satellite space, being from space exploration, satellite communications, Earth observation, and we, provide basically a number of services for government in government agencies and operators, all different kind of let's say actors within this kind of space value chain that we'll discuss today. So as I mentioned, it's consulting, it's a lot of research reports that we do, as well as thematic training for all the different types of looking at financial economics, market research, technical feasibility. So we cover basically kind of the wide range of consulting and research and training activities. We also do events. Probably most famous is the World Satellite Business Week in Paris. I do want to bring one other event to the attention. So, one of the really growing interest and one of the hot topics for our industry is obviously artificial intelligence. So with our partner, Innovitech, we putting this new event together, AI in space. It's going to be virtual, obviously, in this COVID-19 setting. There's a great lineup of speakers from both the, let's say, space world as well as from the AI world. So feel free to look at our website, www.aixspace.ca. Registrations are open, so I hope to see many of you for that event. But that's enough about Euroconsult. Let's talk about the space economy. So the first slide here basically breaks down the space economy. You first kind of separation is you need to look at the commercial part and the government. Today I will talk mostly about the commercial part. Government basically means the government expenditures in the government budgets on space across many countries, obviously led by countries like the US. But today's kind of presentation is really about a question how to grow the kind of commercial part of the space economy. So if you talk about a commercial space economy, we basically break it down into upstream and downstream. And I think, basically the two main key takeaways from this slide is that one, services is really kind of the driving value of our space economy. So if you take the 276 billion here at the bottom, it represents about 74% of the total space economy in 2019. The other kind of key takeaway is, and as we discuss about $1 trillion economy shortly, that if you look in the last 5 years, our economy has been growing, but still at a fairly modest rate of about 7%. So definitely, there's been growth over time, but there needs to be something changing to kind of reach the future projected numbers. So let me zoom in a little bit more about the downstream services, as I pointed out, where all the value is, right? So simplified, you can just break it down primarily today in SatNav and in SATCOM. So SatNav, obviously, you think about your tablet, your smartphone, maybe your latest smartwatch with the fitness apps and so on. Those all have built-in GPS functionalities, which obviously drives kind of a large part of the value. The other part, the big piece, is SATCOM. 45% of the total downstream services today. And a very important distinction is that the video market is still kind of the biggest part of that business. So when I talk about video, I mean the satellite TV, for example, your Bell TV or Shaw Direct, or in the US, it's more going to be DirecTV. So those has been historically kind of a very big part of our space economy, but probably as you all know, this is also a part of the business that is under pressure and in decline. So if you look at, for example, in US, the biggest satellite TV players with millions of subscribers are in decline, basically because of cord cutting. Most of the people are now moving into Netflix and other type of online services. So Well, the market has been growing at many areas. There's also this big base of existing, let's say, value, what is shrinking. So there's always these kind of multiple trends. So that is basically what it is today. But I think, most of you know that our industry is really in this transformation period. So I think you had already had some discussions earlier today with all the new technical innovations that are coming, that are currently happening, driving this kind of, we can talk about AI, but many, many other applications and new insights that are bringing our industry to a new frontier. And it's also largely driven by these demand requirements, and basically as well companies looking at different way of doing and pursuing kind of the space opportunities. So everybody probably is also familiar what we call then the new space factor, and obviously it's maybe a little bit hyped, but it's also very, very important because I think, from many people that have worked in this industry, we really have seen a tremendous change in mindset over the last, let's say, 10 years, maybe max. So for us, the new space factor doesn't only mean, new startups, but it's really like thinking space business outside of the box. And what does it mean? You're looking more at low cost solutions. You're looking more at applications oriented. You're more willing to take technical and business risks, which is in sharp contrast is how traditional space was done and performed, which was really more focused on very customized, risk averse approaches in delivering space, and where the space industry has been very successful. But you really see this kind of new driving force that, in our view, would definitely start to make an impact and open up new opportunities. So what are those drivers and enablers of new space? First of all, technology. I think the technology innovations and miniaturization really helps down to bring the cost of the satellites. We see a lot of interest from AI. So even the big companies like Google, but also like Microsoft, Azure, and others, they're really making more and more work around integrating space and pushing cloud and quantum computing solutions into the space array. Obviously, policy and law is always important. There has been some significant changes in policy and regulations to stimulate commercial activities, not only on, let's say, more traditional use of Earth observation, but also in areas like space exploration. Obviously, why has these changes been happening? It's also because the market has been rapidly changing. So one of the points that we pointed out earlier, that the video is maybe less of a market in the communication side, but there are new demands coming up of increasing connectivity. Everybody wants to be connected anywhere, anytime. Increasing demand for intelligence, which drives EO insights. And also, we're basically overall expecting to get a broadband connection, even if you're traveling on sea or by air. The final point, which I think is one of maybe probably the most striking or most important underlying elements, is that obviously space is very capital intensive, and this major shift of private investments into the space sector has been one of the major enabling forces for new space to happen. And one more additional slide about that, and I think this demonstrates really from a historic perspective. So for example, the chart here on the right shows the cumulative equity investment. So generally considered 2009 as a kind of a tipping point where SpaceX launched this kind of commercial payload in 2009, which kind of embarked kind of this new era. But if you look at in terms of investments, it even is more probably post 2014, where you see a huge investment from equity investment into the space sector. We see that there's not only on the infrastructure side, but especially on the application layer, which is important because, as I pointed out earlier, to really upskill the value of the space economy, it's really in the downstream part of our business. So those have been kind of the key, let's say, factors happening. And what is the output? You see much more companies, much more players into the market. So This is kind of also gives you an indication. It's very much of a sample. You can probably, it will not fit more companies on the slide. So that was kind of a restrictive element to it. But I think, what is kind of the most interesting point of that as well, that if you look at where Canada is in many of the different, let's say, layers or opportunities within this kind of new space or the space economy, we have representation, whether it's in space exploration, whether it's in satellite communications, whether it's in Earth observation or very specialized applications of environment monitoring. We have multiple players in Canada being present and want to be part of, hopefully the $1 trillion economy. So talking about a $1 trillion economy, I think everybody has probably seen, and it's often referenced, right? This is the Morgan Stanley. They've, courageously brought this forecast together. And of course, we can heavily debate every part of this, basically of the breakdown of the forecast. But if you read the report or the extract that they provided with it, they basically point to satellite broadband being the main growth driver. So 50% of the growth, Morgan Stanley believes that will come from satellite broadband. So the next part of the presentation, I will kind of focus on that particular opportunity. So when we break down the satellite broadband opportunity, we basically can do that in two parts. First is what we maybe call the lower hanging fruit, is what we call the mobility platform opportunity. So you have to think about, ships, cruise ships, passenger vessels, merchant ships, or airplanes that are, flying around and moving around the world, and often are at least temporary apart beyond the reach of terrestrial networks. So satellite is a natural solution for connectivity. And it's also what you already seen, there is, from the total addressable market in terms of vessels, planes that are kind of beyond the reach of terrestrial networks, 90% is already have a satellite solution on board. And, with our projections, we expect that to significantly increase over time, because again, the overall understanding here is that most of those maritime, aero, or military users want to have the broadband connectivity on board of their platform or vessel. So that's number one. But the biggest piece, obviously, of the broadband opportunity is bridging the digital divide. So, obviously you've seen the numbers, these very massive numbers of the 3 billion people to be connected. And what is fair to say that although satellite has started to, be there and offer solutions, overall penetration is still fairly small. So based on the number of satellite connections today, about 2% really addresses that opportunity. And if you look at the satellite market as well, there are basically different type of solutions that can be provided. Some of them have been fairly new developed. So on the one hand, you have the residential. So there you can think about the Starlink terminal, where they connect, with an individual terminal. You connect a home, for example, and you can provide a service. The challenge with this service is that it's typically, it's easily, if you just take Starlink, it's about $100 per month. It's a $500 for the terminal. So definitely not, affordable for the full kind of 3 billion that remain unconnected. So in that respect, there are two different satellite solutions available to the market to help to bridge the digital divide. One being the kind of fairly new development around Wi-Fi hotspots, where you basically create a Wi-Fi hotspot with a single satellite terminal, which has a reach of, a number of well, sometimes up to a few hundred of meters, and individual users will go with their cell phone or tablet, get to the access point, basically pay maybe $1 or so for a number of a data basically that they can use and access that point. So this is very popular right now in countries like Brazil, Indonesia, and becoming easily, more and more deployed, I would say, in those markets. The other, which is still a more traditional solution, but which is still continue to grow a lot, is what we call satellite backhaul. Not necessarily going in all the details, but you have to think about, okay, how can we extend, how can you extend your self-service? So obviously, even in Canada, if you go more north, at one point you lose your signal. So with basically building out additional base stations and using satellite to connect this base station to kind of the main network, you'll be able to extend the cellular coverage of many people. So that's overall the broadband opportunity. Obviously, the key opportunity to look for. So what has been happening in the, let's say, ecosystem? I think one of the important parts that is always to keep in mind is that although the value is in the services, those services are enabled by what is happening up in the sky, right? So you do need to have the assets being available and being up there to really kind of be able to unlock the opportunity. So this slide kind of shows what is the trend. Again, maybe not to go in full detail, but I think the kind of key message here is we're creating this multi-layered environment where there are different types of satellite going up, being from very flexible satellites up to the kind of constellations like the Starlink, like the Telesat, LEO, that are really giving much more flexibility, but also much more throughput, much more capacity to help and connect more and multiple users at broadband required data rates. So what does this do? Kind of this full deployment of the new, these new type of assets. It basically does two things. So first of all, it helps to bring down the cost down, because historically satellite capacity has been expensive, especially compared to terrestrial network deployments. So based with the new kind of type of capabilities that are coming to the market, we should be able to decrease the cost by 10 at least for providing capacity or connectivity. And as well, the other major important thing to get like data services that are true broadband, we need to increase as well the available throughput. So that's the other major element. So you, on the one hand, you decrease the cost, but on the other hand, you also significantly increase the available throughput for individual users to be connected. Sorry. Moving on, so definitely one of the key things to watch is these NGSO constellations, which brings a lot of throughput capability to the market. And obviously there are different stages. So I already talked quite a bit about Starlink, but they are also the company that are most ahead. So they have this kind of first mover advantage, if I would say so. Launched, I think yesterday they launched again. So there are now over 900 satellites, and even they are now also active of their constellation. Still need to reach, I believe, either 12 or 1600. Well, they need to get to 12 to 1600 to get kind of full kind of service operation, but they already start to offer services in Canada and the US, which is still more of a beta type of service. Other companies that are pursuing this opportunity is probably you've heard about OneWeb, who just re-emerged from bankruptcy. So that also shows that this is, a very challenging and capital-intensive trajectory to follow. So there are many bumps around ahead for those companies, but again, they've been able to turn around their initial issues and now are back on their plans and plan to launch the next batch of satellites by the end of the year. And they're under contenders. Some are not as well advanced like Amazon. Some of them are pretty well advanced like SES. But let's also not forget about our Canadian, let's say, counterpart or player into the market. So Telesat, who has obviously been for many years in the satellite business, are working towards their own constellation project, which is expected to have the first major milestone of manufacturing contract to be awarded by this year, by the end of this year, and then hopefully moving around and moving the bar to the right and getting up to full completion of the satellite constellation, probably sometime 2023 or 2024. So different contenders, which is important because again, the more different flavors we get, the more different type of solutions you get. And that's also just to point out on this slide that it doesn't mean that all of those systems are doing exactly the same thing. So Telesat LEO, for example, has an advantage that provides full global coverage, where, for example, SpaceX only provides a part of coverage, for example, of Canada, as you see right on this chart. It goes up to about 7 degrees north. And also they maybe offer or target different markets. So Starlink, for example, addresses really the consumer broadband market, while Telesat more fits within, let's say, the mobility, as I pointed out, like the air and sea, let's say ships, or maybe more of a backhaul solution for expanding networks. So again, there are different solutions for different kind of applications, and we all have to see what best fits those different types of the solution, different type of applications. So it's a very dynamic, a very competitive market environment, and we'll definitely see how that will play out over the next 2-3 years. So coming then to kind of the question about, you know, how to unlock this broadband opportunity. So yes, the success of the NGSO projects like the OneWeb, like the Starlink are very important. So it's one of the top conditions to make and make the broadband opportunity work. But it's not the only part. There are many other parts within, let's say, the unlocking that and successful achieving the bridging the digital divide. There's a number of other factors that need to happen. So one is the terminal. You may have heard that the development of the terminals, especially for NGSO constellations, is still kind of in its early development. So there are solutions available, but the cost and the reliability of those solutions are still kind of need to, and the issues around it are still need to be ironed out. So it's very important, especially if we move into markets that are more cost sensitive, to get to a terminal that is very affordable for, you know, emerging countries, especially in Africa. The third kind of category to it is the sustainability in what we called USO, so Universal Service Obligation missions. As you probably have seen, and same here in Canada, many countries are pursuing the broadband initiatives, where they set aside money and funds to basically help connecting the remaining population to a broadband. Canada, for example, is a great example where they are supporting, for example, Telesat LEO in bringing connectivity to the northern communities. And this is very crucial as it helps to stimulate and subsidize some of those satellite solutions in markets. And especially it provides kind of an anchor support for the, let's say, companies that need to develop the infrastructure and the services around it. So it's a critical factor to make sure that the broadband opportunity will be achieved across different countries around the world. Two other points, the network integration. One of the main things here is that satellite needs to get better integrated into terrestrial networks. So one of the things is to really expand and help bring satellite as a broadband kind of digital divide solution to closely work and seamlessly integrate with the telecom networks, which is really worked on with this 5G development, which should help to facilitate that. And finally, obviously, it's all about cost. So we are talking about massive cost reductions, but those cost reductions need to trickle down to the individual user, because otherwise we still are facing the affordability challenges that are kind of experienced today. So if I bring it back to kind of the question about the $1 trillion economy and how realistic that is, first to say, I think, you know, if we look at, we look today at more particularly at the satellite broadband opportunity, the kind of the objective set or the amount or the kind of target set by Morgan Stanley looks very, very ambitious, very aggressive. And basically all those kind of points that I highlight here, kind of all the stars need to align to really get close to that number. So first of all, that's, I think, we're on a track, but I think, especially how much time it takes to get to those connecting all the remaining part will take time to do. So the 2040 on the one hand is still 20 years away, but it's also, for most of these deployments, there's a lot of time to build that out. The final point on it's 2040, obviously, 20 years from now. So satellites, we're probably applications that are kind of listed today that we identified that where satellite can play a role, but there might be many new applications that we have not thought of today that will be apparent in 2040 and driving a lot of the value. So just fair to say that the new space development, as we pointed out earlier, also brings it out of the box a new creativity that probably from the mix that I present here on this last slide of applications, there might be 4 or 5 new that we are not aware of today that can drive and build our space economy to the $1 trillion target. So with that, that's the end of the kind of talk presentation I prepared. Happy to take any questions that if you have. So Hussein, back to you.
Well, thank you so much, Nathan. Great presentation. $1 trillion economy. I know it's bound to happen. We've got many questions for you, and I'll start off with the one that's most voted. What is your estimate to when satellite industry will reach saturation due to limits on the sheer number of satellites that can be put into orbit around Earth?
Oh yeah, it's a good question. It's hard to say to put out an exact number there. I mean, again, even if you look at the constellations, they all fly at different altitudes, obviously. So there's, I think, space at the end is big as well. Obviously, with that also comes the responsibility to well track, monitor, and manage the traffic of space objects. So that's obviously one of the when we increase that number of objects into space, it's maybe becomes at one point some of the limiting factors, right? If you're not take well responsibility around it. So in principle, with I think well responsible management of that, I think there's not necessarily I think a restriction that I would see being imminent. But again, that is the caveat that we play as a satellite industry that responsible role.
Excellent. The second question, and we'll end it off there. Will the change in GEO comm satellites to more flexible payloads drive the transition to fully electric spacecrafts, or will the focus be on payload and not propulsion?
Oh, it's a good question. It's a bit of a technical question. I do think that the focus has been on payloads, obviously, but I think if it's going to be fully, if there's advantages, so basically where we're looking at two things is one is standardization, right? So one of the key drivers is to standardize as much as possible, so you bring down the cost. The second point is that the flexibility. So if you provide more flexibility, and I think that's primarily driven on the payload, you can have, you can de-risk a little bit your business case because you'll be able to change, the available supply that you bring to satellites or when the demand patterns change, because that's something that happens all the time. So I think if that kind of, if there's a standardization or cost saving, yes, I think that's a trend and way to go on every level of the satellite kind of manufacturing component level. So that's, I would say, the trend to look for.